human factors is a scientific discipline in itself that looks at, the people, the job, the task, the organization, how people interact within the system that they are working in, right?
This might be a very big question, but how do we better prepare individuals to translate that work as imagined, that directive, that CPG, to the real world in these very difficult to manage, complex circumstances in the safest way?
And I always think about paramedics as a great example of this, right? Because you're thrust into dynamic situations where you don't know what's happening. But what I walk into in this living room or in this factory or wherever I am, it isn't always going to line up with this, right? So we talk about workarounds in human factors, right? So here's the thing, here's real life. And somehow we've got to figure out how to do the procedure or the medication, whatever we're doing safely in an environment, in a situation that isn't safe or optimal to do this, right? It's a point of contention that is wrecked my my patient safety career. Is why didn't they? They should have. They could have. And I'm like, no, you were not there at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Ivan, welcome back, man. It's good to see you.
Hey guys, it's good to see you. It's good to see you guys. Thanks so much for having me back. I appreciate it.
Open invite. But tell us, what's the difference between human factors and quality metrics and quality improvement, or is there a difference?
Yeah, look, I think it's a good question. It's a question that I ask myself and continue to ask myself too, because I think, as paramedics, whether you're, involved with the base hospital or a regulator or whatever the case is, like you probably hear these terms kind of thrown around a bit. And I'm sure everyone's got their own, I don't know, idea of what those things are. But I suppose broadly speaking, like human factors is a scientific discipline in itself that looks at, the people, the job, the task, the organization, how people interact within the system that they are working in, right? So, and within human factors, people come from the engineering background and psychologists, sociologists, things like that. But yeah, fundamentally, they look at how people interact in the system. So, paramedics, for instance, right? How does that paramedic interact with the ambulance, the equipment, the patient, their medical directives, their partner, dispatch, their base hospital, the Ministry of Health, so on and so forth, right? These are all systems that we interact with regularly. So human factors looks at the system broadly. But then we get terms like, quality or quality improvement or continuous quality improvement. And then patient safety comes into that. And I suppose, from my perspective, those are each kind of, it's kind of like medicine in itself, right? So you have medicine and then you've got specialties within medicine, emergency, anesthesiology, ICU, so on and so forth. I think in the broader kind of, systems approach to things, like these facets, CQI or quality or patient safety, are all kind of, their own little, disciplines within the broader system. So I think human factors is especially useful when they partner with these things. So, if there's a quality improvement initiative that's going on, right, whatever it may be, you're going to have a quality improvement specialist or someone who's well versed in it, who are going to use things like lean or Six Sigma or PDSA cycles, these type of things, which are really important and like kind of fundamental to quality improvement. I think where human factors can come into that is that, we can look at the system, how people interact within that system, how the work is done, how it isn't done, what the workarounds are, so on and so forth. And that can inform that quality improvement initiative, right? So if you, make a plan to do X, Y, and Z, that's great. But what you probably need to know is how the work is done in the first place. Similarly, like we'll use the broad term quality, right? Quality, in my view, can be kind of more metric based. So KPIs, data, things like that, quality assurance, right? Audit probably falls in there somewhere as well, which is, kind of measuring those data points there. Human factors comes in and says, okay, so let's look at this data and how it, came to be, I suppose, like what the input versus output. So from the system perspective, right? So the thing with human factors in the broader sense is that we are kind of taking a look at how people operate within the system and the outputs that they come with from there. So similarly, like my specialty or my background is patient safety. So when I use human factors in patient safety, that's going to be different than QI or CQI or whatever. Um, but I look at it from a system perspective. So I want to see how the work is done, right? So you're on a hot call, maybe there's a med error or something like that. I'm going to be looking at, you know, the person, the job, the task, the equipment, the organization, everything, and how it interacted or contributed maybe even to that patient safety incident. So, um, yeah, like I think, you know, like I said before, there's this taxonomy that we use or that kind of gets thrown around sometimes, and I'll put my hand up too. Sometimes I get confused myself. So that's just my perspective on kind of what quality versus human factors is and how they kind of interact.
Well, what we hear you saying is they're linked, and they have to be linked for obvious reasons. And when you're going over, I was thinking, because I found this anecdotally, that it's either a love-hate thing when people hear human factors, they're like, "Oh, I love it," or if you bring it up, they're like, "Oh, here goes this guy again with his human factors."
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like, okay. But why do you think people either love or hate it? Why do you think that is?
Um, yeah, I think that's an interesting one and definitely something that, I've seen in my own kind of time as a patient safety specialist, as a human factors researcher, things like that is I think maybe historically it was broadly, and this is just my perspective, seen as kind of a bit of a fluffy type of science or discipline, if people would even call it that. But um, I think a lot of it probably comes down to maybe misnomers and maybe a bit of a misunderstanding, specifically in healthcare. So other industries, I think, have gotten it historically speaking. Aviation, nuclear, rail, the military, they've gotten it. In healthcare, I think it is only now starting to kind of the pendulum's starting to swing back. So in my in my master's research, one of the key things that we wanted to try and figure out was, how is human factors represented in paramedicine research, right? So we kind of, cast a wide net for that. What led me to that, asking that question was, well, I think, human factors in paramedicine in general, or probably across healthcare, more broadly speaking, is like, you know, it would have been considered human factors equals non-technical skills. So communication, leadership, crew resource management, things like that. That's human factors. Um, Now I think it's kind of shifted the other way, where it's being viewed as I mentioned earlier, kind of human factors equals patient safety. So there's these kind of disconnects, and there's a really great article that just came out by Liam Chadwick and I think it was Angela O'Day, called "Reclaiming the Systems Identity of Human Factors and Ergonomics in Healthcare." And the article does a really great job, kind of building on previous articles done about this kind of misconceptions of what human factors is and what it can do in healthcare and in our context in paramedicine, right? So it's not just the patient safety review. Like, it contributes to your easy load stretchers and your stair chairs and how your kit is laid out in your bags and how your ambulance, the back of your ambulance is designed. In a perfect world, I would love to see it, human factors and human factor specialists kind of, taking part in medical directive design, right? Education, things like that. Like, I would love to see that. So I think maybe people's misconceptions, we'll just call them that, probably stem from kind of a historical place too. And that was, broadly speaking, in healthcare, we've, I'm going to say healthcare broadly, we've kind of cherry picked things from other industries, right? So like checklists, aviation, mad for checklists. The difference between and the article I just mentioned kind of, I believe it mentions this as well, where it's like healthcare took a checklist and took crew resource management on its own, where aviation built that into a system perspective, right? So it's embedded. It is fundamentally part of it. So I think, when people hear human factors, paramedics hear about it, I think in fairness to them, and not casting shade on anyone, right? They've probably kind of gotten a piecemeal image of what human factors is and how it can benefit them and the patient. So I think that's probably where maybe some of those misconceptions have come from.
The first thing that's coming to mind when you mention the ambulances and checklists, it's one I can remember so many times, and I fully admit they called me. I created the biggest mess. I was one of those paramedics because you'd open the cupboard doors and you'd be like, "Where is anything?" Because everyone customized their own ambulance because it wasn't standardized.
Yeah,
So I'd
exactly.
literally just like sweep across the bins and knock everything over to find what I was looking for. And the second thing is that you said the piecemeal stuff, because I've been at fault for this too. I probably still am at fault when you have checklists, but when you look at the checklist, it's like this long, saturated with
Yeah,
text. And I thought if I'm in the middle of a recess and I look at this thing that's like an essay, that's not going to help me
yeah,
under duress and everything.
yeah. Absolutely, man. And that's it 100%. Like I do work with organizations and things like that rely on policies and things like that and stuff. And I'm like, well, you've got 137 policies. Like, yeah, how is it reasonable to expect paramedics or staff to know the ins and outs of all 137 policies? Some might be 4 pages, others might be 42, So like, this is kind of it to your point, Ryan, is like where, you know, just taking a checklist and then putting it in for your RSI or whatever you're doing, like it's important, but without looking at it and applying that from a system perspective, right? When I say system perspective, I mean like, you know, have the paramedics had the opportunity to train in this? Have the paramedics received ample education in this? Like, this checklist isn't supposed to be the be all and end all. It's supposed, it should be easy to read, easy to follow, things like that. But that's kind of like the end of a long line of things that should probably happen before then, right? So yeah, absolutely. Like it's definitely something we see quite a bit of, where we just kind of, I don't know, sometimes people just hang their hat on a checklist.
I think sometimes something that's difficult to push on like these decision makers is like, okay, you might want this like 47 item checklist to make sure that absolutely everything gets done. The problem is in that case, you might as well not have a checklist because it's going to never be opened. I don't remember
Yeah,
exactly what the sweet spot is, but I think it's like 7 items, right? Like is the max that people actually use these checklists for. And then like you said, like building the system around it. Like I'm thinking about these really high performance systems with their RSI kits, and they have like that rollout design for their intubation kits. It's like you put each piece of equipment there, and then you put your checklist here, and then you go through it. Like you systematize the
yeah.
entire procedure with the team. I think there's no shortcuts to that, and making that 47 item checklist or policy on it is not going to get you those results.
No, exactly. And like, it's one of those ones too where I think back to concepts like work as done versus work as imagined, right? So like if you give that paramedic ample training, the opportunity to train, the opportunity to practice, and kind of hit these things home with an accessible checklist, right? You probably have, it, a pretty good chance that they'll be able to do the task very well. Um, but there is always this disconnect when I think we see this, and it's not just paramedics; it's across healthcare. When we see policies or checklists or CPGs or medical directives or whatever, they're designed, not always, but I think more frequently than not, they're designed not necessarily by people doing the work, or more importantly, witnessing the work being done. So, with the best of intentions, of course, absolutely, right? Like they want to make it accessible, they want to make it easy to read. Maybe there's nice colors and an algorithm and a flow chart. Great, but what we know about healthcare is that it is a very complex socio-technical system. So what, you know, thankfully 9 times out of 10, things go well. And I always think about paramedics as a great example of this, right? Because you're thrust into dynamic situations where you don't know what's happening. You get a little bit of information, you have to think on the fly. I think they're a really good kind of test for this to see, this is, we have our, medical directives and things like that in this little book here. But what I walk into in this living room or in this factory or wherever I am, it isn't always going to line up with this, right? So we talk about workarounds in human factors, right? So here's the thing, here's real life. And somehow we've got to figure out how to do the procedure or the medication, whatever we're doing safely in an environment, in a situation that isn't safe or optimal to do this, right? It's not going to fit into an algorithm. So, that's always something you're 100% right, Jacob, too. It's like, so when you roll out the 47 item checklist, it's a good backup, but like there's probably several other steps that need to happen, well before that.
This might be a very big question, but how do we better prepare individuals to translate that work as imagined, that directive, that CPG to the real world in these very difficult to manage, complex circumstances in the safest way? Like, is it to better understand the directive? Is it to better memorize the CPG? I don't think so. Like, is it just getting back to like that foundational knowledge, knowing the evidence behind it, knowing the reason that it's there? Like, what do you envision would be the best way to prepare folks to perform there?
That's a loaded question. Great question. I don't know that I actually have the answer to that. I think if I just from my own experience, as patient safety and things like that, I think first off, there needs to be an acceptance that, and this is in the context of paramedicine, that, we all know is dynamic and fluid and can change at the drop of a hat. Um, let's just accept that as fact, that your medical directive may or may not apply 100% of the time, right? So let's first off accept that as fact. Um, or there's going to be a patient with some strange underlying condition that we don't know about, and something might happen or it might not happen. So I think, in the first instance, yeah, let's accept that as fact. The second bit I'd say is, I think from my experience working in the places I worked around the world, and I always come back to this, and I think my human factors colleagues are kind of tired of me saying it, but I think paramedics are brilliantly positioned to kind of lead on these bits and pieces. And I think we talked about this previously, is that like to lead on being champions, in human factors for their profession, because you're expected to respond to situations that, you know, vary drastically, minute by minute, call by call, things like that. So I think as a profession, and as people, paramedics have built in this adaptive process or this adaptive ability that I know exists in other facets of healthcare, but I think paramedics do it in a way that is unlike anything else, right? So I think paramedics need to be nurtured in that regard. Like I'm thinking back years ago, and it still holds true in some regards, right? So I used to be told that if you had a rationale for doing something, that was going to be your saving grace, right? Why you did or didn't do a medical directive or varied, if you had a sound rationale. I don't know. I'm hands up. I haven't practiced in Canada in about 5 years, so don't know if that's changed at all. But I think we need to leverage paramedics' adaptability, creativity, and really lean into trusting them to make that decision. That's just my take. I'm happy to be corrected on that, but I think, yeah, like you're basically have given these well-educated, well-trained individuals a pocketbook that lists what you need to do for this medication or this intervention, and then sent them out into the world. And more often than not, they do it they find a way. And I think, from my perspective, I think, we need to lean into that more. I think paramedics are great at that.
Let's linger on that a bit because I love the topic of work that is imagined because it's definitely not translatable to the real world. And I always love it's kind of an old argument when they said, "Isn't that your job to adapt in the moment?" It's like, true, doesn't make it any easier, and I was never really trained to see bed bugs crawl over me or the patient during an intubation. Like, that's obviously gonna affect my performance, but I always thought too, like, I have a critically ill patient that needs dopamine, and we're on the 2nd floor. Do I
Yeah.
start it here to give them a vasopressor at risk to dislodging it down the stairs, and I can't titrate it appropriately, or do I wait to get them to the ambulance? I was never really trained in that situation or meet the medical directive, and that's the nuance of the pre-hospital setting, and that's work that's actually happening. So how do we actually design or consider human factors in all this, as you were saying?
Paramedics need to be kind of supported in their decision making. Again, I go back to that if there's that sound rationale, because if you're looking at a potential incident or a potential, or maybe not even an incident, but like, you're just kind of doing your quality assurance review, right? Of a chart and things like that. And you see, oh, well, there was a 10-minute delay to dopamine, right? Like, stop and think for a second that, okay, so you see the output, right? So again, hindsight bias, outcome bias, we see the outcome. So let's like just take a breath for a minute there, but realize that, um, yeah, you weren't in that hallway or that apartment or going down and had to make those decisions. So I think, from kind of a human factors perspective is, can you work out the decision making? Probably not. But I think what we can do is lean into supporting paramedics in their decision making if there is that rationale, and not lambast them if, again, hindsight bias strikes and you said, well, you should have done this. It's a point of contention that is wrecked my my patient safety career is, why didn't they? They should have. They could have. And I'm like, no, no, you were not there at 3 o'clock in the morning. Like, please don't come at me with that. That is, we need to take a step back, look at a broader. I'll get off my soapbox in a minute here, lads. But but like, you need to take a step back and look at, the systems that were in place, right? I think about dopamine too, and what a nightmare that is to like just set up and run. I'll put my hand up. Like, it was my Achilles heel as an ACP, and then, you know I rarely used it in other settings and things like that. But like, it was one of those ones that even just the setup and running of it is a nightmare that kind of sets people up for, potential adverse events to happen and things like that. So another level of stress, another level of things to worry about. So yeah, like, I don't think we can really simplify the decision making perspective, but I think what we can do is lean into the fact that paramedics are well educated, well intentioned, and have been put into a position where they have to adapt on the fly, and yeah, lean into that and support them when they make a decision to do something or not do something, and try and understand that decision.
I think that's, when you're looking at that logistics scenario there, like it's borderline impossible to get that done with the tools that you had at your disposal, right? And that's the system that restricted that. So I think allowing the paramedics to have that like dynamism in their practice to, address those needs in the moment is kind of crucial.
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. And I think, yeah, it does come back to this thing that comes up quite a bit, similar to just culture, but like psychological safety, right? Like, when clinicians, whether you're a paramedic or not, like, if you know that you are trying to, or you're making the best decision you can, it may not be the right decision, but like, you are trying to make the best decision that you can in a circumstance that is, arguably, worst case scenario for a lot of people. I think having that psychological safety, knowing that, okay, look, I think this is the right, not starting the dopamine now, while I'm bouncing in an elevator, like God forbid the elevator stalls or it gets stuck, right? Or whatever happens, like, I go back to that rationale for doing something or not doing something. So, I think that psychological safety to be able to make those decisions and then come forward if it doesn't work out, right? If something does go terribly wrong, like to feel safe enough to say, this was my thought process while I was doing this. And no, you're not going to get lambasted, later on.
So let me weave this in to focus on the point of figuring it out in the moment, training, and patient safety. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, does human factors encompass human performance? Because I remember two situations where we had a post-arrest patient that was intubated, and the elevator was not big enough to fit the patient. And I'm like, well, what do we do here on the 17th floor now? And I was like, okay, I have to figure this out. Never had to deal with this in my life. And obviously, there's a delay and it messes up your whole decision tree at that point. So, does human factors actually involve human performance and being able to calm your mind to make decisions soundly and the best you can for the patient and their safety?
Yeah, so I suppose, like, from kind of the human factors perspective too, right? So that decision making in the moment and things like that, like, you know, when we look at human factors, again, I go back to the people in the system and how they interact and things like that. That human performance piece, there's actually quite a few, paramedic led initiatives about, calming the thought process, and that contributing to clearer decision making, right? So, while human factors does look at the broader system to try and examine how those decisions are made, and let's be honest too, like you cannot foresee every scenario. Like this is a thing I often say if I'm doing education or a workshop or something like that, is like, let's just get this off the table first and foremost. You cannot prevent incidents from happening. Just like like this idea that you can reduce risk to zero is not realistic. I think of, I don't know if I've mentioned it previously, but um, in the UK they have this list of things, never events, right? So never events are essentially, you know, if adequate safety measures are in place, these events should never happen, right? So it's an inappropriate medication, chemotherapy is administered in the wrong way, so on and so forth. Um, I think they came around initially in like the early 2000s, I think in 2002. But yeah, they're events that are considered, wholly preventable. And they're widely adopted by many healthcare systems. Um, the problem is that like they still happen, right? So we're going on 20 plus years and they still happen. Um, and I think the issue with that is people are still, or I shouldn't say people, organizations are still working on the premise that you can reduce patient safety incidents completely and altogether. And that's just not what the data is showing. Like, you know, I think I'm just off the top of my head, something like in the first half of 2022 in the UK, there was like 170-ish never events reported. Um, in the US, I think around the same time, no, it was either 2020 or 2019, just off the top of my head. So forgive me. That was about or 450 never events occurred. And these are predominantly in hospitals, right? So in a nice, and possibly people don't come at me for this, but in a nice building, in a box, in, controlled system setting, right? Um, so, these things still happen. And it's similar to the zero vision movement that's kind of, you know, been adopted from road safety and things like that, where like, you know, there should be zero largely preventable catastrophic adverse events in healthcare, whatever. Don't get me wrong, that is an amazing goal. Like no one wants to access healthcare and have something awful happen. But I think it's the wrong paradigm. Um, and the difference between road safety, you know, aviation, nuclear, and things like that, is my view is that healthcare, paramedicine included, is very complex. It is a very complex socio-technical system. So, you know, that's just kind of my little tangent on that, about kind of, I shouldn't say accepting the fact that things will happen, but like acknowledging and trying to be okay with that. We will do our best to reduce patient safety incidents. We will strive for that. But especially in paramedicine, in the untold, you know, vast dynamic nature that is the world, right? With all the variables that you go into on every call, on your way to every call, on your way back from every call, like to aim for nothing, no adverse events happening, I think is probably setting people up for failure, and I'd say this is, might be an unpopular opinion, but I do stand by it. I do. Like, so, I suppose kind of back to your original point too, Ryan, like, so human factors, looking at kind of that mental model, right? So human factors does look at mental models, right? And how teams interact and shared mental models and things like that. So, um, that's one facet. But as for kind of taking steps to kind of calm yourself in these high stress environments, yeah, I think there's loads of people out there kind of doing this really important work.
Something I've been thinking about is how we kind of engineer the system around decreasing, and in those cases, like to zero. Like the goal is zero. These errors of commission or omission in our system, and that's like one domain of quality, right? Is safety. But then if we over optimize for that, are we sacrificing the other domains of health quality in the pursuit of this perfect safety?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is something that's come up quite a bit in kind of some of the patient safety literature in the context of human factors, is right, like reducing things down to checklists and protocols or medical directives and things like that. It's there's a few papers out that I'll have to just double check on, but there's a few papers out that can come out in the last 10 years or so that's kind of looked at, physicians, right? And their perspective on kind of, when checklists or protocols or things are introduced that really relinquish their autonomy, which, actually has another knock-on effect when we talk about well-being, right? So we're talking job satisfaction, burnout, stress, fatigue, things like that, right? So, there's this, like, I'm sure there's this fine balance that checklists and protocols and things like that would be kind of synonymous. I'm sure when some of your listeners might think of, human factors or crew resource management or things like that, they think checklists and protocols or whatever. But, you know, um, these physicians that had these multiple checklists kind of imparted on them, found that their autonomy was, reduced, and that had a knock-on effect into their kind of overall well-being. So I think there's probably a fine balance there somewhere. Checklists and directives and all that good stuff are useful and they're important, but they are one part of a larger picture.
And that goes back to, we always like to simplify it. And this is almost like human factors. It's binary, it works or it doesn't. When in actuality, all things can be true. Checklists can be beneficial, but also giving people autonomy is also beneficial. And every other skill or attribute we can put into the environment. Because as soon as you're thinking that, I want to linger on work imagine and just workarounds a little more, because our initial instinct if someone does a workaround is, why didn't you just follow the checklist, or why didn't you just follow the policy? When in actuality, if we should step back, we should think it's, what's wrong with the system that they're operating in that they have to do a workaround, and they're probably one of several that are doing the same workaround. Because of course no one's like facetiously gonna not put the end title on and throw it across the room with the intubate. Like that's a different workaround than
Yeah,
somebody
yeah.
naturally just being like, this is, I feel frustrated doing it this way, so I'm gonna do it this way for the best of the patient.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Like, look, and I think kind of just back to that original point, autonomy too, I think, or reduced autonomy when things are put into strictly protocols and checklists and whatever, like when you reduce that autonomy, you're actually probably reducing adaptability as well, right? So you've got a booklet, a checklist that you need to do for this procedure. Um, but this is a weird and wonderful kind of scenario that you found yourself in. And yeah, you know, can't do the first 6 parts of this checklist, right? So like, yeah, just kind of coming back to, the workarounds too. Like, it's only recently that I've kind of really appreciated how important workarounds are in healthcare, in paramedicine. Um, and I think that speaks to the diverse kind of nature of the profession and the environment that it operates in. Workarounds exist all across healthcare, right? For years, the hospital systems would have said, electronic patient care records are the be all, the end all, the fix all. And then they were implemented and new issues came up, right? And people had to work around them. So, you know, a lot of these things, a lot of these interventions, while very important and good for patient safety and paramedic safety. I love that too. Two things can be true at the same time. They are important. However, when we go back to the systems perspective, once you introduce something new like that, you can't always foresee the potential issues that arise from it, right? So like, again, I go back to that adaptability and the importance of the workarounds and, you know, acknowledging, and I'm not saying people have to reinvent the wheel here or anything, like the importance of acknowledging when a well-intentioned group of people pull together a medical directive, right? They have to make it, and I'm not casting shade on anyone. Like I completely understand it, but like they have to design something that is easy to read, especially in a high stress moment, that is, straightforward, not too hopefully text heavy, hopefully, um, and needs to be useful for any myriad of situations, right? That you find yourself in. So that's your, the work as imagined bit there with all the best of intentions. And then we give it to a bunch of paramedics who go out in the world, and the world isn't, you know, it isn't straightforward. It is complex, and scenarios that paramedics find themselves in are complex. So I keep coming back to this bit about leaning in and supporting the adaptable nature of paramedics and really nurturing that. Because I think for the most part, if I think back to kind of, my days in quality assurance and things like that, the vast majority of work that is done by paramedics is done well and done safely, right? And I think that's, very much like a testament to their adaptability and taking those documents and those bits and pieces that are imagined again with the best of intentions, but and then taking them into the real world and using them, and they're probably applicable 90% of the time, which is great. But there is that 10% where the weird and wonderful happens and they have to shift focus or skip part A and B because, you know, for some reason the thread on the end of the end title CO2 isn't going into the Zoll monitor for whatever reason. This one, okay, there's an issue there. So I didn't do that. And I think kind of back to what we were talking about at the beginning about maybe misconceptions around human factors is that like sometimes it just gets reduced down to non-technical skills or crew resource management. But I think, Ryan, like you kind of just succinctly pulled a really good description of human factors and paramedicine together really well there, right? Like you identified, we've created a system that is applicable to most paramedics 90% of the time, acknowledging that 10% of the time it may or may not work the way we want to. And when it doesn't, we're going to try and learn from it. We're going to try and improve it. We're not going to, rake anyone over the coals for it. And acknowledging the fact that we will probably have to do this again and again and again.
Found this valuable, please like and subscribe. This helps us to continue to have high quality, evidence-informed conversations for our paramedics and clinicians. Additionally, this episode is supported by Charlie Meal. So it's this Whitby-based company that honestly customizes meals each week. You go on the website, you get to pick your meals based on your nutrition goals, your preferences, and they even deliver to your house. And people always laugh at me that I have such a high caliber taste, apparently, that I will either eat at 3 Michelin star restaurants or just rice cakes. Nothing in between. And honestly, I genuinely couldn't recommend Charlie meals enough, especially for busy families, for shift workers, when it's extremely hard to help prepare and have nutritionally dense food that's actually taste palatable. They do it and they deliver to your house and they last a long time. They can be put in the freezer and reused. There's the website in the description below and as well as the link towards it. So please check it out. Additionally, I have built an app. Isn't that fun? So basically, I've seen over the years how the scope of practice of paramedics is rising. The amount of information is also escalating and the time to do it is kind of condensed. So you can see the problem with that. And honestly, I just tried to simplify pharmacology, pathophysiology, very content dense topics and break it down as simply as possible, but also with the nuance of making it as operational as possible, because that's all adult learning. It has to be relevant to your everyday needs. So it's basically a clinical platform that you understand the medical directives, you understand the reasoning behind the medical directives, and how that actually connects to pathophysiology, pharmacology, and other high tier concepts. And we break this down into scopes of practice. We break it down to that could be simplified for a beginner, for a more intermediate person, for an expert, every layer. And the more you put into it, the more it understands you and your reflection upon your critical thinking and how you actually make decisions. And it'll just feed higher back returns into you. So it's this outsized return. The more you put into it, the more you get back and understand your decisions and how that's relevant to everyday practice. I'm going to put it on the App Store soon. It's in beta phase. Please check it out. And honestly, if you have any ideas that you want to see into it, please let me know and I'll try to integrate it because it's all built on the user in mind because that's truly what matters. Lastly, we highly recommend Casper, which is the Canadian Ambulance Service Paramedicine Research Repository. It was created by Dr. Alan Batt and his amazing colleagues to give free, open access research repository dedicating to fostering the open science and overall bolstering the visibility of paramedic research and any empirical evidence and overall just information that can help increase the awareness of what's going on in the paramedicine world and shining a light on those shaping the profession at large, whether it's across Canada, in Ontario, or across the world.
This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not medical advice, does not establish a standard of care, and must not be used to diagnose, treat, or manage any medical condition or emergency. The content discussed reflects general principles that may not apply to every situation, system, or patient. Clinical practice varies by region, service, and jurisdiction. Always follow your local medical directives, clinical guidelines, protocols, and the instruction of your medical oversight or base hospital physician. The host, guests, and producers make no representation, guarantees, or warranties regarding the accuracy, applicability, or completeness of the information shared. The views expressed are those of the individuals and do not necessarily reflect those of their employer, regulatory bodies, or medical oversight authorities. By listening, you acknowledge that the host and guests assume no responsibility or liability for any actions taken or not taken based on the content of this podcast. This material is intended solely as a supplemental educational tools to support ongoing professional development, not a substitute for accredited training, certification, or authorized clinical guidelines.